Welcome to another episode of Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War in the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Ryan Evans. I serve, among many other things, as the publisher of the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org. Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. Senator from the state of Texas and former permanent representative of the United States to NATO, is our guest on this episode. And European security in the context of the war in Ukraine is our topic, with a large side of energy policy. And the conversation is thoughtful and wide-ranging. But I'm going to let my friend, William Inboden, the founder and head of the Clements Center, take it from here.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Will Inboden, the editor-in-chief of the Texas National Security Review and the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security. I'm sitting here in Austin, Texas, with my good friend, Senator Bailey Hutchison. I could take our entire episode reading her distinguished bio. I won't, but just a few highlights. As Senator Hutchison served a number of years representing Texas in the United States Senate, where, among other things, she was a leading voice on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And then she also more recently served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, representing our interests over there with our most important allies. She wears many hats back here in Texas now. For those of us at UT, we especially appreciate her leadership of the KBH Energy Center for Business, Law, and Policy, a multidisciplinary center here at the university. So, Senator, it is great to have you.
Well, thank you, Will. I am so glad to be with you always because, of course, you are the security expert, and our Energy Center has so enjoyed working with you because energy is now a security issue. And it is a focus that we're going to have in our fall symposium and that we had last year as well. And we want you to be a part of that. So we will be talking about that. But I want to hijack you for a minute before you start questioning me. I got your book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan and the Cold War and the World on the Brink, and it is wonderful. And what I haven't read the whole thing, but I did want to read as much as I could before we sat down. And I was fascinated with things I didn't know about the background of Reagan and his progress on foreign policy, and especially that Eisenhower really adopted him, and I hadn't realized that they had that close relationship of Eisenhower seeing that he was a great communicator and understanding that the Republican Party needed a kind of a reboot, a jolt. And so he took Reagan under his wing and did influence Reagan's foreign policy outlook, which I thought was so interesting, and that it somewhat diverged from Nixon. Although Nixon was supportive of Reagan, made suggestions, Reagan took some, not all, but I thought it was a fascinating way to show some of the background on Reagan's foreign policy, because he's known for Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. I mean, he was a foreign policy leader that really did transform. And of course, that led to really the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, the peaceful end of the Cold War.
Yeah. So I loved it, and I hope more people will get a chance. The academics have read it, but I think more people will benefit from seeing that transition that Reagan made really on instinct. You know, he had an instinct. I always thought he had an instinct for the issues that people cared about, the silent majority. But his instincts were right on foreign policy too, just from a moral standpoint.
I really appreciate your kind words, of course, about the book. And I'll just say that the revelation about Eisenhower's early mentorship for Reagan was one of the most surprising and exciting revelations for me from my research. I hadn't known that going in. But as you were highlighting, Eisenhower, saw Reagan on TV in 1964 after his A Time for Choosing speech. Eisenhower at that point was retired in Palm Springs, reaches out to Reagan, says, hey, let's get to know each other, encourages him to run for governor of California, encourages him to run for president. And they have this series of discussions over the next few years, the last few years of Eisenhower's life, about the importance of a strong domestic economy to our national security, about the importance of being very careful about using force, not being too cavalier about getting into an overseas war, especially one with boots on the ground. But that if you are in a conflict, you've got to fight to win and not just to delay losing. Reagan came to really revere Eisenhower, and it was a really interesting, important relationship.
Well, and the last point I'll just make is that deterrence was the strength. It was to avoid war, and to do that was to build up, have the capacity, but not have to use it.
Yeah.
And that was an Eisenhower thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Those military people, and I found this at NATO, Will, our military people don't want to go to war. They know the travesty that is a war. And
they're not trigger happy at all.
They're not. Yeah. And I found that at NATO with all of our military leaders. And that's why they have adopted that peace through strength mantra, which is what we're doing right now, to take it fast forward to where we are with the potential of an adversary in China. Our government is now needing to start coalescing our allies and using the strength that we have to really basically send a signal that it would be too expensive for China to do something that would go against the rules-based order.
Yeah, exactly. That's in some ways the best way to prevent a war with China or a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is to have enough of a formidable military ourselves that Beijing will know that they cannot get away with this, that they could not win. And that's the core of deterrence. So
that is, and also keeping NATO united.
Yes,
because to get to the end of our interview, the leverage that we have is not military with China. It is economic. And China needs the world's greatest economies, the G20, to trade for his domestic capabilities, for his domestic economy. So if we can stay united, and we have to stay united in order to show China that it would hurt China inside.
Yeah.
China's economy, China's ability to create jobs for the future.
Yeah.
If they didn't.
Yeah. Oh, amen to that. So, well, we will circle back around to that. But there's a number of things I want to cover here, especially drawing on your recent service and leadership at NATO headquarters and the U.S. mission in NATO. So first, it was 14 months ago this month that Russia invaded Ukraine, and I think that was the last time we had you on the podcast. So this is a great occasion to start by revisiting what has happened in the just over a year since. So first, let's talk about the energy situation. You rightly highlighted a little over a year ago worries about Europe's excessive reliance on Russia for energy supplies, Europe's need to, build more LNG terminals so they could get natural gas from, non-Russian sources. So looking, now that we have the benefit of hindsight, tell us your take on Europe's energy supply situation now, in April of 2023, and then anything that might have surprised you over the past year from where we've come.
Well, certainly energy is at the center of keeping our alliance united because Europe did depend too much on Russia. We tried in every way to show them that was a wrong way to go. And when we were energy independent in America, we had the capability to start exporting to our allies, to start strengthening them. So what's happened this year is Europe now gets it. We were fortunate to have a mild winter, so they had enough stored to be able to get through the winter. But we now need to be able to export more. And more European countries, including Germany, are building receiving facilities for natural gas. We're still a little late in being able to supply them completely, but it's getting better. And certainly, if we could become energy independent, which we must do again, then we can afford to export to our allies to strengthen them for the long term, for dealing with Russia, which is always going to be a problem if Putin is is in charge. And for the foreseeable future, that's what we're dealing with. So I think that we're going in the right direction. We're not there yet, but we need to look inward for our strength to be energy independent so that nobody can touch us. So that when Saudi Arabia says we're going to lower our output by 1 million barrels a day, which is what they have done, we can say, well, that's not going to affect us because we are independent of any other need. And we're not there yet, and we need to make that a focus right now of our government, and it should be bipartisan that we would make that commitment.
Well, continuing on this theme of kind of transatlantic solidarity and the situation for Europe especially, I know one of the big things you worked on as U.S. ambassador to NATO was keeping the alliance together, especially to confront the common threats of Russia and China. And we'll come back to China. But how would you describe the state right now of NATO solidarity and unity, particularly around the Ukraine war?
I think that NATO is united, and I think they have remained strong, and that is going to be necessary really for the long term, certainly for Russia and dealing with Putin for the near term, but for the long term, for dealing with China, we must stay united. It's very troubling what has just happened with President Macron going to China and saying that they won't be tied to America on the Taiwan issue and declaring that they are going to go their own way. Well, that means if we don't stand together, we're going to fall if we are separated. And that is such a wrong message for Xi right now. We need a strong message that we're going to stand with Ukraine because we're not going to let another sovereign nation be invaded by a neighbor. And secondly, to try to show China that it would be too expensive to go into Taiwan and kill people, and that it would not be in their interest, their economic interest, to do that. So I think that we must stay united to have that deterrence that we talked about Ronald Reagan having as his strategy for foreign policy. And there's so much more that we have to do domestically as well as with our allies. Yeah,
and I'll come back to the domestic part in a second. But further to the NATO question, as I think about things that have been surprising over the last 14 months, one, of course, has been Germany, right? Initially under Chancellor Scholz, a very strong German posture of finally increasing their defense spending to 2% of GDP. Eventually agreeing to allow the Leopard tanks to be supplied to Ukraine. These are significant things. This was not Germany even a few years ago. It's somewhat of a change from Germany's more almost pacifist post-war posture. But you dealt with the Germans a lot when you were there in Brussels. What is your take on Germany's staying power on this question of alliance solidarity and support for the Ukrainians? Or do you think that we're going to perhaps see that begin to erode?
I think they will stay hitched, but they are slow. As you said, they have been pacifists since World War II. They still are in the aftermath of World War II. And we saw that time and again at NATO. They will lead on economics. They are the strongest economy in Europe. But on security, they purposely don't lead. They purposely don't have their troops trained for offense. Their troops are trained for defense, but not offense. So we still need to work with Germany and bring them along, understand that it's not going to be as quick as we had hoped, and that they are a strong ally of America. They understand the importance of American leadership, whereas sometimes France tries to undercut America's leadership, as we saw in his own words just this past few weeks in dealing with China. But Germany is steadfast. They know that Europe can't do anything on their own. Europeans are not. They're not instinctively ready to assess a risk and then deter against it. They just don't do it. They didn't do it after World War I. or World War II, and here we are again. So we have to continue to push. What I found at NATO is that the other countries want us to push. They want us to push because they know that we are the leader, that we are the ones that also have the intel, and we will assess a risk, and even better, we will deter against it, and we'll push them to do it. They don't do what we ask them to do, like we ask them to do 2%. And they will say they're going to go toward 2% and that they are going to try to do 2%, and they're slow to do it. And that frustrates some of our politicians. But they are doing better, and having allies is a whole lot stronger than not having them.
Yeah.
And so I think I would say to my colleagues many times, look, if you expect the Europeans to be like us, you'll always be disappointed. But if you know that we're better off with 31 voices and than having one voice, just America, speaking alone, and you're getting some of the things done that help, which they do. They contribute a lot at NATO. It's not equal with us, but it is a lot, and it's a whole lot stronger that we have that kind of help. Otherwise, we would be doing it alone. So I think if you lower the expectations and you don't expect them to be like us, but you do realize they have a value and that they do want interoperability, they do want our leadership, and they want to be with us. So you just have to keep pushing and be a little more patient than some of our people are.
One more NATO question since we got you here. Of course, another big change since our last discussion this 14 months ago is NATO is getting bigger. The enlargement with adding Finland already just completed, and Sweden, it looks like on a path to membership if they can get through some of the roadblocks that Turkey and Erdogan are putting up. How significant is this for NATO to have Finland as a member and potentially soon Sweden as a member?
Oh, it's huge. It is huge. They have been interoperable with NATO in a very favored ally status. They've been a partner, not an ally with the Article 5, but they have trained with us. They've done operations with us. They're in our missions. They were with us in Afghanistan. They've been with us in Iraq. They are real partners, and they have a strong military. They have the same values that we do. Their military are honest, they're trained, they're good, and they have the equipment. And they're buying, Finland's buying F-35s, and that's going to make them interoperable. And they're totally trustworthy partners, and Sweden will be too. When I got to NATO, I've talked to the Finns and the Swedes because we were close with them, and we brought them in so many ways, and just gauging their interest in being an ally, and many of them wanted to be all along, but their populations weren't there. But once that Russian invasion happened, it was very quick. The populations were for it. They did the polling to make sure that they weren't getting ahead, and I think they're going to be very valuable allies, which are going to be very important as we face the obstacles for the next 20 years.
Yeah. In a kind of a perverse way, Putin has accomplished what Stalin and Brezhnev and other Soviet leaders couldn't, which is get Sweden and Finland into NATO. So,
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
Putin thought that he was going to divide NATO, which he's been pinging NATO with cyber and hybrid and misinformation out there, trying to divide the publics and make NATO into an aggressive, negative force. They've been doing that for years, but they thought they would be able to do this and that we would do what unfortunately happened after the invasion of Georgia and then the Crimea. And they thought we would object, and then we'd walk away and say, well, that's not our fight. And I think Putin has been surprised because he has accomplished what all the others have tried, and he's made it happen.
Yeah, I know.
NATO
So
is stronger.
Yeah. So I'm sure he's not happy about that, but the results speak for themselves. So I want to pivot now a little bit to drawing on some of your experience as a previous elected official in the U.S. Senate, the world's greatest deliberative body, as well as someone who is still pretty in tune with public sentiment in the state and the country. And I know you talked to a lot of your former colleagues in Congress. Tell us about American political support for continuing to supply Ukraine with weapons and economic aid. A number of very generous packages have been passed by strong bipartisan majorities in Congress. But as we were talking earlier, we see some signs of diminishing support on kind of both ends of the spectrum, maybe the far left and the far right, if you will. So what's your take on the viability of continued American support for Ukraine?
I think that the leadership of both parties is very solid in support of Ukraine, understanding the need for us to help the Ukrainians. They're the ones that are fighting, not us on the ground, but help them win against Russia. And that will set Putin back and stop his menacing of the other countries that are in his radar. I mean, certainly Belarus and Moldova would be next on the list because he's going to try to surround the NATO countries. And that has to be stopped because it's going to get more and more expensive. If we don't stop it now, if Ukraine doesn't stop it now with our help, then it's going to become more expensive with each day that goes by that we have to do more. But also, I think our leaders see that long-term message to President Xi of China. And I think that I think the disaster in Afghanistan caused both Putin and Xi to say, well, maybe now is our time to do what we've wanted to do for a long time. For Putin, it would be to recreate the Soviet Union, and of course, Xi to take Taiwan and to use their economic leverage to work their will in trade and other areas. So I think that started, and if we don't finish the job and help do that with Ukraine, I think they would think, okay, now is the time. We can keep doing whatever we want to do, and they'll yell in the West, they'll object, and then they'll lose interest and go away. That can't happen, and our leaders understand that. You see the bipartisan leadership in Congress, and President Biden has been strong on that. Having said that, though, Will, I do think it's time that we look at doing more for Ukraine to help them finish the job. They're getting crucified.
Those something like 100,000 dead Ukrainians already. Yeah.
It's just awful. And they're destroying the country.
Yeah.
You see all the carnage. And I think that now we know that Russia is trying to gear up to do more. And I would like to see our administration working with Congress to say we need to give them what it takes to win and not just hold off. I mean, we've had a stalemate for over a year, and Ukrainians have shown that they can do this if they have the capability in arms.
They've got the will to fight. They just need the tools. Yeah,
they do. And we need to look at giving them the air power and giving them the ability to take out the sites in Russia that are putting these missiles in the air and destroying their infrastructure. I mean,
don't let right across the border be a safe haven for these Russian missile sites.
Yes, right. And so those are just two things that I think could really make a difference for the Ukrainians. And I think they've shown what they can do, and they deserve our support, our full support.
Let's pivot now to something we've touched on a few times already, but I want to give you a chance to share some further thoughts on, which is the China question. And one of your big accomplishments as U.S. Ambassador to NATO was getting China included by name in NATO's strategic concept. And this was significant, right? Because, as big and important as China is, it's not there in Europe. Okay, so NATO countries had not used to, traditionally thought of China as a part of their strategic concerns, but for very good reasons, China has to be. Tell us a little more about your take on European views towards China and And if NATO is ready to kind of take the next step of a stronger posture towards China, especially given that the EU is still a very important trading partner for China.
I think that is really two questions. And the first one is that we have strength because of our economic power. And China needs to be able to have the trading relationships with our economic power. And I think that it's going to take a lot of pushing of Europe to say security should be first and economics second. Europe's never done that. They've always put economics first and security second.
That was their posture for Russia before. And and that continues to be their posture with China. Yeah.
And so we've got to really work to do that. But having said that, I think that you are seeing a transformation in NATO. You mentioned that we're not used to having NATO assess a strategic risk outside of the European arena. Well, NATO is now becoming the convener of the like-minded, the convener of countries that want our way of life, freedom, rule of law, free press, human rights. Those who want that are in Asia. They're even in the Middle East. And NATO has 31 now allies. We have 40 partners already. And they're throughout the Middle East and Asia. And
just to clarify, that's 40 additional partner nations in addition to the 31 NATO agreements. Wow, yeah, that's substantial. That's 71 nations we're talking about.
71.
With some commitment to NATO values.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That is. And so I think it is important that you see this transformation. For the first time last year, the NATO summit, which is the heads of state meeting, included 4 Asia-Pacific heads of state, and they all came. And that, of course, was Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And we brought them in because they know the risk of China. They're all out there and very vulnerable. And you've seen already what China did, trying to use its economic leverage with Australia. Australia stood up, but we need to be partners with Australia and Japan and, of course, South Korea and New Zealand. And hopefully bringing India into that, but I think that will come as things progress. But NATO is going to continue to do that. They're going to be a convener of the like-minded, the democracies and the freedom-loving people in the world, so that we will have that unity. And I think NATO is going to be the security umbrella that will bring that about. Now, that's all in progress, and it's just in the beginning stages. But we started that when I was at NATO, and we did finally get China in the strategic risk analysis. And at first, when the U.S. Defense Department announced that our 10-year plan has to include a potential adversary of China, well, our European partners looked around the room and said, "What are you all talking about?" But then they started seeing what happened with Australia, the Belt and Road Initiative, where China used some very strong-arm tactics with some of the European ports, and they were very upset about that. China then said, "Oh, and we are also going to include in our Belt and Road Initiative the Arctic Belt and Road." China doesn't have 1 inch of space on the Arctic.
Yeah.
But start looking at why China would say that they have an interest in the Arctic. Well, they don't have any nexus with the Arctic, but Russia does. So they are now looking at these little islands in the Arctic, and they're saying, well, we want to partner with Russia doing scientific experiments and research on these islands in the high north. And that is to start getting down into the Arctic for Greenland and Iceland, where they have rare earth minerals. As the ice is melting and the land is becoming more able to be worked.
Yeah.
China is beginning to make that Belt and Road go all the way across the top and into those other countries. So, all of this to say that we're now in a global situation where the Europeans are starting to see for themselves, and we were showing them all the intel that we had and the things that China was doing openly, not to even mention the whole COVID thing where they didn't warn people if it was accidental. At least they had that duty. And so that's what brought in then in this last summit where the strategic concept was adopted by all of the nations. And that's just a beginning. I think you're going to see that umbrella, and I think NATO is going to be the convener that keeps going in that direction.
Yeah. There's so much in there, but I just want to particularly emphasize that point you made about NATO's power and influence goes well beyond just, the formal treaty commitments of the 31 countries or even their military, interoperability and capabilities, but also this convening power, this demonstration effect of kind of planting a flag for any other countries who share our values globally, right, to address these global challenges. And China's designs on the Arctic, as you mentioned, are obviously part of its new partnership with Russia, as well as its insatiable appetite for natural resources. All right, so time for one more question. I know there's we could be going on for hours here, so much to discuss, but I want to bring this back around a little closer to home here in Austin. The KBH Energy Center here at UT recently hosted your spring conference, and the theme was energy infrastructure. So tell us any highlights or big takeaways from the conference, or any other kind of highlights on the KBH Energy Center's work this academic year.
Well, thank you for that, because it is so much fun working in the UT Energy Center that brings in the law school and the business school, and more the engineering school, where we're putting these students together, and we are beginning to put in place some of the courses that the students that are from outside the normal course, like engineering students into the business school courses, law students into the business courses, and even beginning to let business and law students take some of the engineering courses for eventually a certification that if you want an energy career, that you could get a certificate that said you had taken these courses in the 3 schools that would attach to engineering. And what came from the spring symposium that we have, and then we have a great one in the fall, is more and more now our young people who have been very anti-oil and gas, anti-fossil fuels, are beginning to see that, yes, the transition must occur, and yes, everyone agrees on that, but it's not going to happen in 2 years. It's going to take time to keep our economy strong. We've got to make sure that we have the energy that is ready to fuel our economy and to be safe from any outlying sources that, like Saudi Arabia just did, to cut us off of import of oil. We need to be sufficient. And then we need to be looking at the ways that we can cleanly produce the oil and gas and cleanly transport. One of the things that has been lost that we talked about in our symposium is that pipelines are actually the cleanest way to transport fossil fuels. When you have to put it on trucks to take it from Canada down to Louisiana, or from Pennsylvania up through New York because they have not let the pipelines be built, then you've got more of a carbon footprint than if you just put it in a pipeline where, like the Keystone XL pipeline, every state in that pipeline route had approved it. The environmental people in those states had approved it, and yet now we don't have it. And
but President Biden still canceled it. Yeah.
Yes, and then Canada is shipping its oil by ship and having to take it by truck to the ocean. Or trucks could go to Louisiana, but it's just not. I think what's happening is that more and more people are understanding. We want to produce clean natural gas, which is a really good, clean energy source, and it's reliable, and it is stable.
Yeah.
But we also need to do that research that we are doing right here at UT, and how are we going to get batteries that can fuel the solar and the wind so that it's stable and doesn't go out in the middle of the day because it's overused or because the wind goes down or it's a cloudy day. Yeah, so we need to do the battery research. We need to be able to do the wind turbines that are more efficient, and we need to do all the research. Like, we're going to meet with a wonderful researcher at our own energy school, Dr. Clark, who's doing hydrogen research. And he's doing it for propulsion because he's on the NASA Advisory Council with me. But that can be also a totally clean fuel, like nuclear also is a clean fuel. But both of those are too expensive right now. So we're now working with our researchers to make these silos that are smaller, and whereas it would be too expensive to build a big hydrogen plant or a big nuclear plant, you could do it, though, in smaller amounts and provide a completely clean energy system. So those are the things that we talked about in the spring, and we will talk about it in the fall symposium as well. And I'm pleased that you have cleared the day for us, because we want you to work with us, and especially interviewing on the energy security issues that you have done so well at focusing on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.